The hegemony of enlightened species had for the past 4,000 years operated under the delightful assumption that they were the universe's crowning achievement in evolutionary sophistication. 847 different races had come together in what they like to call harmonious intellectual unity, though a more accurate description might have been a mutual admiration society for beings who had forgotten how to throw a proper punch. These weren't your garden-variety space barbarians, mind you. The hegemony prided itself on having transcended such crude biological imperatives as territorial aggression, resource competition, and that particularly unseemly habit of solving disagreements through violence. Instead, they had developed elaborate philosophical frameworks for conflict resolution, 17 different forms of meditative consensus building, and a bureaucratic system so refined that it could take 6 months to approve a request for office supplies. The Vorthak, with their crystalline neural matrices, spent their days composing symphonies of pure mathematics. The Elinari had evolved beyond physical forms entirely, existing as clouds of sentient energy that debated ethics for centuries at a time. Even the relatively primitive Gorth had managed to eliminate warfare from their society, choosing instead to settle disputes through interpretive dance competitions that could last for decades. This was civilization, they assured themselves. This was progress. This was what happened when species grew beyond their crude animalistic origins and embraced the higher calling of intellectual pursuit. The discovery of the escape pod changed everything, though at the time none of them realized they were staring at their own obituary. The craft itself was laughably primitive: welded metal plates, chemical propulsion systems, and what appeared to be duct tape holding several critical components together. The hegemony's salvage crews found it drifting near the outer rim, its occupant barely alive in what could generously be called a life support system. Any self-respecting species would have built something more sophisticated in their Bronze Age. Inside they found the creature was bipedal, which was common enough. Roughly 60% of sapient species had settled on that particular body plan. She had 2 arms, 10 fingers, and those curious forward-facing eyes that suggested a predatory evolutionary path, though the hegemony's xenobiologists were charitable enough to assume this was merely an unfortunate genetic legacy from less enlightened time. What struck them immediately was how familiar those eyes looked. Not identical, certainly the iris patterns were unique, the colors strange, but there was something about the orbital structure, the way the lids were arranged, that reminded several species of their own ancient ancestors. It was as if someone had taken a dozen different evolutionary templates and mashed them together into something that was almost, but not quite, universal. Convergent evolution, declared the hegemony's chief xenobiologist, a Telinari whose own eyes were compound structures that could perceive 17 different spectrums of light. Fascinating how certain features appear repeatedly across unrelated species. The preliminary scans were where things got interesting, though the scientists conducting them were too polite to admit it. The bone density readings came back 3 times before anyone believed them. The muscle fiber composition suggested a creature built for explosive movement rather than contemplative stillness. Most puzzling of all were the organs. There seemed to be backups for everything, as if evolution had decided that redundancy was more important than efficiency. Perhaps their homeworld was particularly hazardous, suggested one researcher, trying to maintain scientific objectivity while staring at scan results that showed a cardiovascular system designed for combat situations. Some species develop robust physiologies in response to environmental pressures. The creature's brain structure was equally confusing. Large, certainly, but organized in patterns that made no sense according to established models of intelligent species developed. Where enlightened beings had learned to partition emotion from logic, this species seemed to have deliberately intertwined them. Where advanced civilizations had evolved beyond aggressive impulses, this creature's neural pathways suggested those impulses were not just present, but carefully preserved and refined. It was, the xenobiologists concluded, like finding a military-grade assault rifle in a museum of antique farming tools. The creature remained unconscious for 72 standard hours, during which time the hegemony's finest minds debated what to do with their discovery. Some suggested immediate integration into their peaceful society. Surely any species capable of space travel could be taught to appreciate intellectual pursuits over crude physical activity. Others recommended careful study, arguing that such a remarkably preserved example of evolutionary primitiveness could provide insights into their own species' distant past. None of them suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, they should have asked themselves why a species this physically capable had managed to reach space travel at all, or why, if they were truly primitive, their escape pod had been sophisticated enough to traverse interstellar distance, or why the creature's hands, even in unconsciousness, seemed to curl into shapes that looked suspiciously like they were designed for gripping weapons that didn't exist in any civilized society. But then again, when you've spent 4 millennia congratulating yourself on being the pinnacle of galactic evolution, certain questions simply don't occur to you. They were about to learn that evolution had played a rather different game than they'd imagined, and that sometimes the species that looked most familiar was the one you should fear the most. The creature's awakening was by hegemony standards refreshingly dramatic. While most civilized beings emerged from medical stasis with dignified confusion and polite requests for orientation, this specimen's first act was to attempt what could only be described as a tactical assessment of her surroundings. Her eyes snapped open, not the gradual, contemplative flutter of an enlightened mind returning to consciousness, but the sharp, predatory focus of something evaluating threats and opportunity. The assembled xenobiologists found this quite charming, in the same way one might find a pet's aggressive posturing amusing. "Greetings," began Dr. Helith, the hegemony's foremost expert in first contact protocol. His species, the Altani, had perfected communication through harmonic resonance patterns that could convey complex emotional nuances across any language barrier. "We extend the warm embrace of galactic fellowship to you, unknown traveler. You are safe among friends who seek only understanding and mutual growth." The human blinked twice, turned her head with mechanical precision to catalog every exit, potential weapon and defensive position in the room, then looked directly at Dr. Helith and said, "Yeah, where am I and how do I get out?" The assembled scientists exchanged the sort of meaningful glances that academics use when encountering behavior that doesn't fit their carefully constructed theory. Clearly, this species had not yet developed the sophisticated appreciation for ceremonial greetings that marked truly advanced civilizations. "You are aboard Station Harmony 7, Dr. Helith explained patiently, the premier research facility of the Hegemony of Enlightened Species. We discovered your vessel in distress and brought you here for medical attention and cultural exchange." "Cultural exchange," the human repeated, sitting up with a fluid motion that made several security monitors chirp nervous warnings. "And the medical attention part, am I a prisoner or a patient?" The question hung in the air like an uncomfortable fart at a philosophy conference. The hegemony had long since evolved beyond such crude distinction. In their society, all beings were simultaneously free and collectively responsible, individual yet unified, autonomous yet guided by the greater wisdom of the group. The very concept of imprisonment had been relegated to historical curiosity, filed somewhere between ritual sacrifice and reality television. "Neither," Dr. Helith assured her. "You are our honored guest, while we facilitate your integration into galactic society." The human's expression suggested she found this explanation about as convincing as a Ponzi scheme run by particularly enthusiastic cultists. "Integration? Sure, and if I decide I'd rather not integrate?" The research team exchanged another round of meaningful looks. This was precisely the sort of primitive thinking they'd expected from a species that still used projectile weapons and chemical explosives. The poor creature clearly hadn't grasped that individual desires were merely stepping stones toward collective enlightenment. Over the following days, the hegemony's finest minds attempted to educate their guest in the ways of civilized society. They showed her their magnificent art galleries, where abstract concepts were rendered in 17 dimensions. They demonstrated their advanced conflict resolution techniques, which involved sitting in circles and discussing feelings until everyone reached unanimous agreement. They explained their post-scarcity economy, where resources were distributed according to need as determined by algorithmic analysis of societal benefit. The human listened to all of this with the sort of polite attention one might give to a small child explaining why vegetables were actually candy in disguise. "So let me get this straight," she said after a particularly lengthy presentation on the hegemony's achievement in eliminating competitive behavior. "You've created a society where nobody fights, nobody competes, and nobody takes risks." "Precisely," beamed Dr. Helith. "We have transcended such crude biological imperatives. And you've been doing this for 4,000 years. Indeed, a testament to our evolutionary superiority. The human nodded thoughtfully. And in all that time, has anything, I don't know, threatened you, challenged you, made you adapt or grow stronger? The question struck the assembled scientists as rather odd. Why would one seek out threats or challenges when the goal of civilization was to eliminate such inconvenience? It was like asking why they didn't deliberately break their own technology to make life more difficult. We have achieved perfect harmony, explained Dr. Fenth, whose species had eliminated physical conflict so thoroughly that they'd forgotten they even had teeth. There is no need for adaptation when one has already reached the optimal state of existence. The human's smile was a thing of beauty and terror, though the hegemony's representatives interpreted it as simple appreciation for their achievement. They failed to notice that it was the same expression a shark might wear when discovering a school of particularly plump fish. Optimal, she repeated. Right. What the hegemony's brilliant minds had missed, despite their 17 different forms of advanced pattern recognition and their sophisticated behavioral analysis algorithms, was that the human had been conducting her own assessment. While they lectured her about the benefits of peaceful coexistence, she had been cataloging their defensive capabilities, their response times, their tactical awareness, and their complete and utter lack of survival instinct. She had also been testing their security systems, not through crude attempts at escape, but through the sort of patient, methodical probing that any competent military would recognize as reconnaissance. A casual question about facility layout here, an innocent inquiry about staffing patterns there, a helpful observation about structural vulnerabilities disguised as architectural curiosity. The hegemony's security protocols, designed to prevent escape attempts by beings who would politely request permission before leaving, proved remarkably transparent to someone who viewed locks as puzzles rather than absolute barriers. As the human settled into her temporary quarters, spacious, comfortable, and secured by systems that assumed their occupant would respect the philosophical principles underlying their confinement, she began to laugh. Not the gentle, harmonious laughter of enlightened beings sharing intellectual humor, but something sharper, more predatory. The sound made the facility's automated monitoring systems flag her for psychological evaluation, though they classified it as possible mental distress rather than what it actually was. The sound of an apex predator realizing she'd landed in a petting zoo. The human's escape began at precisely 0347 hours, station time, during what the hegemony optimistically called the contemplation period. Those peaceful hours when all civilized beings engaged in quiet reflection or restorative sleep. It started with something the security logs would later record as a minor ventilation anomaly, which was bureaucratic speak for somehow the human had dismantled her room's entire air circulation system, using nothing but her fingernails, and what appeared to be a philosophical approach to metallurgy. The first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong came when security chief Vorth, a Delani whose species had evolved beyond physical violence, so completely that their word for fight had to be borrowed from ancient archaeological texts, received an alert that the human's bio readings had vanished from the monitoring grid. Perhaps a sensor malfunction, suggested his assistant, because in a society where the most dangerous thing that happened on a typical day was someone forgetting to water the meditation gardens, the idea that their guest might have actually disappeared was roughly as plausible as spontaneous combustion. Vorth dispatched a maintenance drone to investigate, which promptly discovered that the human's quarters now contained a hole in the wall just large enough for a bipedal creature to crawl through. The hole appeared to have been carved using some sort of precision tool, though their inventory showed no missing equipment. It wasn't until much later that they realized the precision tool had been a dinner fork, applied with the sort of patient determination that civilized beings had bred out of themselves millennia ago. By the time Vorth realized they were dealing with an actual escape attempt rather than a fascinating cultural misunderstanding, the human had already accessed the facility's maintenance corridor. These tunnels, designed for automated repair systems and the occasional introspective engineer, had never been intended for security purposes. Why would they? The hegemony's guests were invariably grateful for their hospitality and would never dream of leaving without proper departure ceremonies. The human, unfortunately, had not read the manual on proper guest etiquette. She moved through the station's infrastructure with the casual efficiency of someone who had clearly done this sort of thing before, while the hegemony's security forces scrambled to implement protocols designed for beings who would politely announce their intentions to leave. She was already 3 levels down and gaining access to systems that weren't supposed to be accessible to anyone without advanced engineering degrees and proper authorization codes. How is this possible? Vorth demanded as alerts began cascading across his command center. Our security systems are state-of-the-art. They were, indeed, state-of-the-art. If your definition of art included 4,000 years of peaceful coexistence, and the assumption that potential threats would helpfully announce themselves before causing trouble, the Hegemony's defenses were rather like a museum's security system, excellent at preventing civilized people from touching things they shouldn't, but completely unprepared for someone who viewed do not touch signs as suggestions rather than absolute command. The humans' methodology was particularly insulting to their sensibilities. Instead of attempting to hack their sophisticated computer systems, which would have at least shown proper respect for their technological achievements, she simply ignored them entirely. When she encountered a locked door, she didn't try to crack the encryption or override the access controls. She removed the hinges. When she needed to access a restricted area, she didn't attempt to forge credentials or exploit software vulnerabilities. She crawled through the ventilation system. It was like watching someone solve a complex mathematical equation by eating the chalkboard. The situation escalated from minor security incident to existential crisis when the human reached the armory. The Hegemony maintained weapons, of course. They weren't completely naive. But these were ceremonial pieces, museum artifacts from their species' more primitive eras, kept more as reminders of how far they'd evolved than as functional equipment. The human examined their collection with the sort of professional interest that should have been their first clue that they were dealing with something outside their experience matrix. She picked up a Vorthak plasma rifle, a weapon so ancient that its instruction manual was carved in stone, and within 30 seconds had identified its primary firing mechanism, backup power source and optimal grip configuration. Crude, she muttered, but functional. This was approximately when Security Chief Vorth realized that their guest might not be as helpless as they'd assumed. The Hegemony's peacekeepers arrived with all the tactical sophistication of a neighborhood watch committee responding to reports of a missing cat. They approached in formation, broadcasting calming harmonics and carrying non-lethal restraint devices that were designed to gently immobilize uncooperative guests without causing psychological trauma. The human took one look at their approach pattern, which prioritized emotional reassurance over tactical effectiveness, and did something that hadn't been seen in Hegemony space for nearly 1,000 years. She fought back. What followed could hardly be called a battle, as that would imply some degree of mutual combat capability. It was more like watching a masterclass in applied violence, delivered to an audience of particularly sheltered academics. The human moved with economical precision, using the peacekeepers' own equipment against them, turning their non-lethal restraint devices into impromptu weapons, and demonstrating that their carefully choreographed formation tactics were about as effective as ballet dancers attempting to stop a freight train. The Hegemony's forces had been trained in de-escalation, conflict resolution, and the gentle art of convincing people to calm down and discuss their feelings. The human, apparently, had been trained in how to disable multiple opponents using a combination of physics, psychology, and what could only be described as aggressive problem-solving. Within 17 minutes, she had neutralized the entire security response, gained access to their communications array, and was apparently attempting to transmit some sort of signal into deep space. Stop, Vorth commanded, though he wasn't entirely sure how one went about stopping a creature that seemed to treat their most advanced security measures as mild inconveniences. The human paused in her work, turned to look at the assembled crowd of scientists, administrators, and increasingly nervous security personnel, and delivered what would later be remembered as the most terrifying sentence in Hegemony history. Too late. In the distance, long-range sensors began detecting something that made absolutely no sense according to everything the Hegemony thought they knew about space travel, physics, and the proper way civilized species conducted themselves in the galaxy. Something was coming. Something big. Something that moved with the same casual disregard for established protocols that their guest had been demonstrating. And suddenly, those familiar eyes weren't quite so comforting anymore. The fleet that emerged from hyperspace defied every principle of civilized space travel that the Hegemony had established over 4 millennia of peaceful exploration. where enlightened species announced their arrival with proper diplomatic credentials and requests for docking permission. These ships simply appeared, hundreds of them, materializing from jump points that shouldn't have existed with the sort of tactical precision that suggested they'd been planning this party for quite some time. The vessels themselves were an insult to proper engineering aesthetic. Instead of the flowing, artistic curves that marked advanced spacecraft design, these were purely functional constructs that looked like someone had decided that beauty was secondary to the more pressing concern of carrying ridiculous amounts of firepower. They bristled with weapons systems that violated several dozen treaties the hegemony had signed with species that no longer existed to complain about treaty violation. "This is impossible," declared Fleet Admiral Gethys, whose own species had achieved spaceflight through careful mathematical optimization and thousands of years of peaceful technological development. "No civilization could field this many vessels without our detection networks identifying their industrial capacity." The human, who had been watching the proceedings with the satisfied air of someone whose dinner reservation had finally come through, offered a helpful correction. "You weren't looking for industrial capacity, you were looking for civilized industrial capacity." The distinction, as it turned out, was rather important. The hegemony's first attempt at diplomatic contact followed their standard protocols: broadcast friendship greetings in 17 different languages, transmit cultural exchange proposals, and extend invitations to join their peaceful confederation of enlightened beings. The response was a request for unconditional surrender delivered in what could only be described as aggressively cheerful tone, followed by tactical demonstrations that proved human weapons technology had been designed by beings who viewed the laws of physics as guidelines, rather than absolute rules. "Perhaps we should attempt to negotiate," suggested Counselor Reth, whose species had resolved their last military conflict through a particularly moving poetry competition. "Surely any spacefaring civilization can be reasoned with." The human laughed, that same sharp, predatory sound that had confused their monitoring systems. "Oh, they're being reasonable. They're offering you exactly one choice, which is infinitely more generous than they had to be." The hegemony's leadership found this perspective somewhat troubling. In their experience, proper negotiations involved extensive preliminary discussions, cultural sensitivity training, and carefully structured compromise sessions that could last for decades, while all parties explored their feelings about potential agreements. The humans, it seemed, had streamlined this process considerably. The surrender negotiations lasted approximately 14 minutes, which was roughly 13 minutes, and 50 seconds longer than the humans had initially planned to allow. The delay was caused by the hegemony's inability to comprehend that unconditional surrender wasn't the opening position in a complex bargaining process, but rather the final offer from beings who had already calculated the most efficient method of achieving their objective. "But surely," insisted Counselor Reth, "there must be some arrangement that preserves our autonomy while acknowledging your superior negotiating position." The human admiral, a compact female whose eyes held the same unsettling familiarity as their original guest, considered this request with the sort of patience one might show to a toddler, insisting that bedtime was negotiable. "Your autonomy was never actually yours to begin with," she explained with devastating clarity. "You've been living in a galactic nature preserve for the past 4,000 years, protected by the simple fact that nobody bothered to notice you existed. That protection just expired." The terrible truth was beginning to penetrate even the hegemony's most sophisticated denial mechanism. Their perfect harmony hadn't been achieved through evolutionary. It had been the natural result of removing themselves from any environment where such superiority might be tested. They had created a civilization of house cats, convinced they were apex predators because they'd never encountered anything more dangerous than a ball of yarn. The humans, meanwhile, had spent those same 4,000 years doing what humans apparently did best: fighting, adapting, conquering, and generally treating the universe as a personal challenge rather than a peaceful retirement community. "How many of you are there?" asked Heolith, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know the answer. "Enough," the Admiral replied, which was the sort of response that suggested the question itself was irrelevant. "The real question is how many of you are there, and whether you're planning to make this complicated." The integration process that followed was, by human standards, remarkably gentle. No one was actually exterminated, which came as a pleasant surprise to species that had spent centuries reading about historical civilizations with less accommodating conquest policy. Instead, the humans implemented what they called efficiency optimization, which involved determining what each species was actually good at and assigning them accordingly. The Vorthak, with their mathematical crystalline minds, found themselves managing logistics and supply chain optimization for the human war machine. The Elinari, as energy beings, proved surprisingly useful for maintaining power grids and communication network. Even the interpretive dance-loving Gorth discovered that their elaborate movement patterns translated beautifully into advanced manufacturing choreography. The humans, meanwhile, got back to the serious business of exploring the galaxy, though their version of exploration involved significantly more explosions and territorial expansion than the Hegemony's previous model. They treated the universe as a place to be conquered rather than contemplated, which struck their new subjects as either refreshingly direct or absolutely terrifying, depending on one's perspective. Theolith, now serving as assistant administrator for xenobiological documentation, found himself reflecting on the cosmic irony of their situation. The Hegemony had spent millennia evolving beyond their primitive instincts, creating a perfect society free from violence and competition. The humans had spent those same millennia perfecting violence and competition to such a degree that they'd become unstoppable. We thought intelligence meant transcending our biological nature, he confided to his new human supervisor during one of their weekly efficiency reviews. We believed that true civilization required abandoning our aggressive impulses. The human, who still hadn't bothered to provide a name, apparently viewing personal identification as secondary to functional utility, nodded with something that might have been sympathy. That's adorable, really. But evolution doesn't care about your feelings about evolution. As it turned out, those familiar eyes had been familiar for a reason. Every species in the Hegemony had evolved from predators at some point in their distant past. The difference was that they had spent millennia carefully breeding, educating, and philosophizing those instincts out of existence. The humans had kept theirs, and now, as the galaxy settled into its new reality under human administration, the former members of the Hegemony began to understand that their greatest achievement, the elimination of violence from their societies, had been nothing more than an elaborate form of evolutionary suicide. The universe, as it turned out, was not actually a safe space for beings who had forgotten how to fight. But at least the paperwork was getting done efficiently.